Hi, this is Jen Rubin, editor-in-chief of The Contrarian. I am delighted to have with me a dear friend, Tom Joscelyn, who is one of three co-authors of a report put out by State Democracy Defenders Action, excuse me, Autocracy versus Democracy, the First 100 Days. It is the most comprehensive, most easily accessible report on the topic. Tom, thank you for the report and welcome to The Contrarian.
Well, thanks, Jen. It's great to be here with you again. I
Uh,
talked to you, what was it, a couple months ago already, and it seems like so much has gone on since I last talked to you.
exactly. And that's part of the problem of keeping up. So I think people tend to think in win-loss, like who won the first 100 days, who lost. Give me your best assessment overall of what has been happening during the 100 days and how these two forces, autocracy and democracy, have been interacting.
well, what motivated me to get involved in helping write this report was that I think what's striking to me about the first 100 days is just how comprehensive Trump's attack on core constitutional rights, the separation of powers, the structure of the U.S. government, how he's weaponized the Department of Justice. I mean, there's so many different issues where he has already overturned norms and long established principles that I think that deserved its own sort of report, its own sort of look at that. But there's been a lot of friction too. I mean, the courts have rejected a lot of the Trump administration's moves. Popular opinion seems to be moving against him on a number of these issues. And I think that as we go forward, I think it's going to be very important. I look at this as sort of round one, and we've got multiple rounds to go, and we're still standing in round two. So he didn't knock out the pro-democracy opposition, but the pro-democracy opposition certainly hasn't fully stopped him either.
He says something really critical, I think, and that is he's trying to change the structure of government. He's trying to enlarge the executive branch at the expense of others. Give us a few of the many ways that he's gone about doing that.
Sure. It's interesting. Jen, you and I used to run in conservative circles, and conservatives used to talk an awful lot about the Constitution and constitutional principles and defending the Constitution. I think probably from those days, you and I are probably the only ones that meant it, or at least in some of the circles, the only ones
Yes.
that actually believed in it. Because one of the core ideas of the Constitution is, of course, there are three articles: Article 1, 2, and 3. And there's a separation of powers, and the legislative branch has the most enumerated powers. There's the presidency under Article 2, and there's a judicial. We have an essay in the report. A couple essays touch on this, but one of the essays is called Separation of Powers, or how Trump's trying to subvert the separation of powers. And what he's trying to do is enlarge the executive branch's power at the expense principally of Congress. And a lot of the lawsuits in the court system that we've seen are challenging that. They're basically saying what you're doing is you're violating the principle of the separation of powers. You're violating the Administrative Procedure Act, which was signed into law by Harry S. Truman in 1946 and has long governed federal agencies. That what he's trying to do is undermine that through DOJ, through the Office of Personnel Management, Budget Management, and other ways. And what they're doing is they're attacking these federal agencies that were established and funded by Congress. And they're saying that the executive branch can go in and take a wrecking ball of these agencies and doesn't have to consult Congress to get congressional approval before doing so. And we've seen that with a lot of cases, like the Consumer Federal Protection Board, which was established, in the wake of the financial crisis in 2008, 2009. Seen that with Voice of America and its parent company and its affiliates. Seen that in a lot of different cases. And the courts are saying, hold on, wait. You do not have the power to do this. You do not have the power to infringe on Congress's power. You do not have the power to just toss the Administrative Procedure Act aside. And so that's a big deal here in all this.
What is so interesting is that Article 3, and in particular the district court judges, regardless of who they were appointed by, are very much pushing back. There are more TROs and preliminary injunctions than I can count. And they're having to do so because the Republican Congress has kind of said, we don't have any role here. We're out to lunch. Talk to us a little bit about what Congress should or could be doing. For example, in the tariff area, do they have to let Trump run wild?
Yeah, it's a great point. I mean, so my colleague at Just Security, Ryan Goodman, tracks the court cases very closely, and he's calculated that in 71% of the cases, now there are over 200 cases total, in 71% of the cases in which the courts have issued a ruling, it's been in favor of the plaintiffs for a TRO or some form of injunction, right? And a lot of those cases are immigration related, but then there's a second tier which deals with separation of powers and the issues we were just talking about. And the bottom line is the judicial branch under Article 3 is putting the brakes or trying to put the brakes to what Trump is doing. And you're absolutely right. Congress isn't, right? Because it's controlled by a Republican Party that is really beholden to Donald Trump and his authoritarian persona. So what Congress could be doing, you just mentioned tariffs. It's long established that tariffs are the domain of Congress. There are different statutes where sort of the presidency and the executive branch have kind of been able to carve out more interests in terms of imposing tariffs. But it's quite clear, as you've seen from even Senator Chuck Grassley, who's usually under the thumb of Donald Trump, and even some people in the House on the Republican side, that they could claw back that power, right? They could say to Trump, no, you don't have the power to indiscriminately impose these crazy tariffs. That's the domain of Congress, and they're not doing it, right? And that's why it's so dangerous that we don't have two functioning political parties. We have one party, and then we have another party that's beholden to a man.
Exactly. In addition to upsetting the tripartite system of government at the federal level, he is also reaching into civil society. By civil society, we mean non-governmental things, the press, law firms, universities. What is the game plan here? Is it merely revenge? Is it trying to squash dissent? What is going on here in all these different arenas?
Revenge is part of it in some of the cases, but in a lot of cases, it's also about power and it's about the culture war, the rights culture war. If you look at, for example, the final essay in the series that we have in this report, deals exactly with that, his attack on the media, universities, law, and others, right? Law firms are actually in the first essay, but others, parts of civil society. And when it comes to attacks on the media and universities, it's really striking if you go through, for example, the new FCC's letters to top media companies, or you go through the justifications for attacking, the pretext, I would say, for attacking universities. A lot of it is driven by the rights cultural vendettas, right? A lot of it's driven by the rights culture war against the American multiculture. What I always say is it's the MAGA monoculture versus the American multiculture. And so a lot of these attacks are driven by opposition to DEI, for example, diversity, equity, inclusion programs, by these types of attacks on this sort of leftist ideology that they accuse these media companies of promulgating. And that you can see that all throughout the final essay that we published, that is one of the central motivations here. And it tells you that what's happened is that the rights culture war, the right, Jen, you remember back in the days of Andrew Breitbart, one of the things he would say was that politics is downstream from culture. I think that's manifests itself here in the second Trump administration. You can see the culture war is really affecting the politics and the abuses of power that we see Trump carrying out.
Right. Let's talk a little bit about the law firms. At our 100 Days conference, Sherilyn Ifill talked about how that was the most shocking to her, that lawyers would cede their independence, their First Amendment rights, their Fifth Amendment rights, their Sixth Amendment rights, their loyalty to clients. Talk to us a little bit about the initial reaction and whether you think that shifted over the course of 100 days.
Well, again, if you look at the executive orders, and I think it's chapter 1 or the first essay of the series, we have a rundown of them and a summary. So you can go in and see a summary of what was the motivation behind the executive orders. And as I wrote, it's really three things. It's personal retribution by Trump and his grievances. It's political retribution and grievances, and it's ideological. So a lot of it is motivated by the cases that were brought against them, for example, either in Manhattan or at the federal level. You have the political grievances. He's gone after now. You can see with a presidential memorandum, non-executive order after Act Blue, which is the Democrats' fundamental, principle arm for fundraising. But in the law firms, he's also attacking these executive orders after law firms. He's attacking them politically, and he's attacking them in a lot of cases, again, for their DEI policies. He actually explicitly mentions that. And what I think is telling is if you go to the executive orders, I have to read them again, but I'm pretty sure he actually uses the word me throughout some of these orders. In other words, like this is all because they were attacking me or doing something to me. I mean, it's the total complete personification of the power of the executive branch, right? Completely wrapping it around this man's one thumb. And so I do think that the initial attacks had more success maybe than some of the latter attacks, and some of the big firms are fighting back. But it is troubling that what he's trying to do is he's trying to undermine these key institutions that could present opposition to his authoritarian designs, his autocratic designs, right? Because if you take out the big law firms, there's going to be less power on the legal side to fight back, right? That's really kind of what's motivating it.
All right. One of the things that he seemed to try and then pull back from was there was a lot of, and it wasn't really just rumor, it was based upon solid information, that he was going to go after the nonprofit status of certain NGOs, or what we call 501c3s. These are the groups that do work on behalf of immigrants, on behalf of the environment, and some of them receive funding from overseas. And word had it that he was going to go after them and pull their nonprofit status. He pulled back. Do you have any insight into whether that's some indication that he sees the opposition growing, or was that simply, he'll live to fight another day, go on to something else? He lost interest in one topic.
Yeah, I'd be careful. I don't think it's necessarily these efforts are over. I mean, he has a lot of, I mean, part of what we don't do a lot of time discussing, and I probably should spend more time discussing, is he has a lot of ideologues around him who are really promulgating these attacks and really are invested in them. And I wouldn't be surprised if they try to go down this route again. But that's a double-edged sword. A lot of his actions are a double-edged sword, because if he goes after these NGOs, if he goes after these nonprofits in this way, this manner, he opens up a Pandora's box for the future for potentially another administration to go after his side in that way. Now, I
Right.
wouldn't justify it either way. And I think my suspicion is, I'll put it as a suspicion. My suspicion is that he's gotten some pushback from folks on his own side saying, wait a minute, if we do this, then it's sort of, we're going down a new path here.
Gotcha. So one of the lessons that we know from Brookings' study, from Norm's work, from your work, from others, is that it's crucial for the Democratic opposition to act with collective action, to not let internal squabbles get in the way, to band together. How successful has the Democratic opposition been in doing that?
That's a tough question to answer, really, because I think there's a fundamental tension on the Democratic side, just as there was on the Republican side. Let me just take a step back here for a second. MAGA and Trump leading MAGA was, the culmination of an insurgency from the right against the Republican establishment, right? And what happened is they completely overturned the Republican establishment. There is no Republican establishment anymore. Now it's MAGA and Trump world, and they own it, and they own everything that's happening now. There's been that kind of tension, that friction on the Democratic side too, where you have a more of a populist-oriented progressive movement that wants to topple the Democratic establishment and take control and take power. And we haven't seen that kind of come to fruition yet. But to my mind, that's the political question on the left or center left from the Democratic side that has to be answered, is sort of who's in charge. Is it going to be more of the old school establishment, or are going to be newer voices who are carrying forward a new vision to combat MAGA and Trump?
Well, it is also interesting that with Trump in power, there is a sense of unity and purpose. They could all agree to be opposed to Trump. The rubber will hit the road when, of course, they hopefully get back into the majority, or they have to start creating policy. And then you have primary elections, actually. What are a few things going forward that you're going to keep an eye on and monitoring how this autocracy versus democracy fight is going? What are you going to be tracking?
I mean, the number one thing is, Trump's desire to defy court orders. We see that with some Obrega Garcia. We see that in some of the other cases. How much are the courts going to be able to continue to act as a guardrail against his autocratic impulses, or are we going to have more of an Andrew Jackson kind of situation? That's really what I'm looking for. That's one of the key tells here. One of the other tells is how much, as there's more opposition rises to him, the authoritarian temptation is to use the power of the state, the mechanism of the state, to push it down, right? To tap it down. Does he go that route? We saw some inclinations like that in 2020, where he wanted to use the National Guard in cities and do various things to tap down protests, some of which went awry, of course, but it was motivated by an authoritarian impulse that people around him then stopped. They said, no, you can't go down this route. I don't think those people are around him now to the same level. So those are two of the main things. And then also, how is he, how are his words possibly going to inspire political violence? That was the big lesson of January 6th, is that by tweeting out certain things, he could activate all these people around the country we didn't even know about, who would interpret his words as a call to violence or a call to action, And as he threatens judges or other politicians or other members of the opposition, does that something that happens? Is that something where we see more threats of violence along those lines? So those are kind of three of the things I'm looking at.
I think that's absolutely critical. And in particular, judges. He realizes, I think, that this is a weak spot. That's why he arrested Judge Dugan in Milwaukee. That's why he has been talking about impeaching judges when they go awry. He sees them as a real impediment to his authoritarian vision. And you can always tell what he's concerned about, because that's what he goes to. He's concerned about tariffs. He yells at Jeff Bezos, don't tell them how much it's costing.
Yeah.
Upset at judges, they're criminals. he can never keep it to himself, so we always know his weak spots. Tom, thank you for the report and thank you for coming on. We so appreciate it. And we are going to have you back because, folks, the Contrarian, Tom is one of the most informed, most involved people in really tracking the authoritarian threat. And as many of you know, he played a crucial role on the January 6th Commission. And we all owe him a debt of gratitude. So thank you for joining us, Tom. I will enjoy having you back soon.
Thanks, Jen. It's great to be here.